Thank you so much. All of the presenters were presenting very compelling material. I'd like to invite the other presenters to turn their cameras on so we can have some time for Q&A. I'd like to remind the attendees to put some questions in the Q&A, and I saw that one was answered already. While people are thinking of their questions, I'd actually like to ask a question of Hope. I get the sense that, and I actually have this same concern, so I'm not putting you on the spot. So it seems like your numbers of military are underrepresented, right? You talk about this dark figure, and it seems from your future work, particularly with your dissertation, that you're trying to get at this. Could you elaborate a little bit more about what you think this dark figure is? And for those who aren't criminologists in the room, dark figure refers to the dark figure of crimes that occur that never hit the public, so that don't hit official sources. And so if you could give us a little bit more information, then that would be awesome.
Yeah, and that's kind of the difficulty, especially with investigating military perpetrators, because they tend to be court-martialed. And those aren't necessarily very easy records to get a hold of. And a lot of the issue that we've kind of had in kind of identifying actors with military experience, and I will say the GTD or the PIRUS data set has about 650 perpetrators with military experience. The difficulty for us is to go through, triangulate who those people are and confirm their military status. But then on top of that, we also see instances of, let's say, sexual assault, anti-LGBTQ violence within the military, or even violence and rape or male rape in some instances that is kind of perpetrated in this chauvinistic far-right mindset. So it's very difficult, especially with having such closed data, or at least in terms of military court-martials, to kind of find and shed light on this dark figure.
Yeah, very compelling. Gunther, I see you have a question.
Yes, thank you. I have a question actually to all three panelists about the what your observations are on strategies. I mean, what do these groups want? I know that of course there are some individual actors, but also is there a kind of, can you identify a strategy? Is that they want to intimidate politicians or people who are maybe a journalist or something? Do they want to change the public discourse? Where do they want to go with that? Obviously, they're unhappy about the society and want to change it. But do they have a strategy, or is it more or less then sometimes violence erupts because of their emotions, or is there a strategy behind it?
Thank you.
Carolyn, you
I mean, I can say, I mean, I've studied the militia movement for over 20 years. I started by doing a sort of ethnographic research in Kentucky back in the late 90s. And I think that strategy is not always at the top of militia's list. And for that, we should be lucky. We should count ourselves lucky, because if they were more strategic, we would be in more danger. I think that one of the things that militias are doing now, I think, is actually in response to what Eamon Bundy's militia did in 2016 when they took over the Gallaher National Wildlife Reserve. They had a strategy that they were going to do this, and they were going to have all of this support behind them. When they went into Harney County before the actual takeover, and they tried to get the local ranchers on their side, and also the local militia, they didn't get any of their support. And so, you know, that takeover failed miserably for the militia movement widely. And I think it also helped lead to where Eamon Bundy is now, where he's had his property seized by St. Luke's, and it's become this kind of individualistic kind of thing. So in a sense, we're lucky that they didn't have a strategy. But I also think the militia movement learned something from that in the US, the militia movement. And that is that trying to just think about local politics isn't enough. So I think part of that, when you see this kind of shift starting to take place, and it started before Bundy, but I think it really kicked into high gear at that point, was maybe federal power isn't so bad after all. It's just that we don't like federal power in the people's hands it's been in up to this moment. So maybe now there's this shift and okay, maybe federal power is the goal. And that's a really big fundamental shift in the militia movement. I mean, if you think about, Timothy McVeigh, you think about all the militias in Nevada and other places in the 80s and 90s, even when I was doing this in Kentucky, the federal government was considered evil in and of itself, right? It was this thing that was wrong to have except for the protection of borders. And then, you come to January 6th, but even before that with the Oath Keepers and defending the rallies of Trump and things. It's like there's this kind of sense in the movement that government power isn't bad. It just needs to be in their hands. And so that's the kind of macro level, I think, shifting view. But strategically how they get there, I don't think there's this kind of, macro level approach to it. And you can even see that in January 6th, because the Oath Keepers were there, but a lot of other militias never really thought of the Oath Keepers as exactly militias because they were national in scope. So there's not a single approach to this in the movement. And that's why also Priya and I, we talk about this as a social movement, because it's a social movement, but it's a very horizontally organized one. And so what they want is roughly, generally at a very macro level, the same, but the degree to which they're coordinating with each other and thinking through it in a very strategic way is not super evident.
Sorry, and if I could just add very quickly, I think part of it is also captured in our title, which is county capture. So we're looking at this very much at the local level. And I think part of it is that most of these modern militias have realized that they can have power at the local level. Like that is itself a strategy as far as I can see. And, the sort of rebranding as a civic organization that helps people while at the same time being a bunch of armed, usually men who muster and do all these kinds of things is itself a sort of strategy in that's happening. And I think that's worth pointing out, that maybe we don't need to look for a giant grand macro strategy to some extent, because a lot of this power shifts are happening at the local level where local decisions are made. Like where I live, it's fairly, a lot of the decisions that I face are made at the local level. Like the federal level doesn't matter because we're like, I mean, there wasn't even a Democrat running in my area at this time to make it to sort of put it in that context. So who's on the ground matters, in other words.
So if anyone else would like to respond, that would be great. And then we need to move on to the responder session. Dakota, I see you've unmuted. Please.
Yeah. I just, my colleagues here are better experts on kind of the facts, if you will, of these militia organizations. I'm trying to be the legal analyst here, but even from where I sit, I just find it so fascinating. The motives for these militias and organizations, and how much my impression of it is that just really emotion drives so much of it, because so colleagues mentioned the legalism of it. So there's all this formal legalism in the language of the militia movements. It's something that I've seen in a number of other settings as well, from people without legal training, being very formally legalistic in their arguments and presenting things in the way like that they've discerned some legal principle that the rest of the world, and even courts and lawyers and whatnot, don't understand. They understand this key legal principle, and then that just changes everything, right? And puts them in this position where they're just, things are better for them, right? For like the person who believes that they've been wrongly convicted, you know, they've discerned this legal principle and now they need to be freed, right? Or, you know, for the militias, right? That it's just like, you know, the most important thing, right, is like the militia, right? That's the most important constitutional principle or something. And it's not grounded in law, really. I mean, like there's like legal stuff in there, but it's not, you know, when you sit down and you read all the relevant law, their depiction of the law is not a sustainable one. You know, and so I think a lot of it just comes out of emotion and all that sort of stuff in there. And just the last point I just make, just as an observation, is I'm just kind of continually fascinated too by the extent to which they go to the language of tyranny and oppression, and that was, you know, evident in the patches that were shown, and you know the language is all over it, right? Like, you know, they're in the position of, you know, having to you know, throw off the oppressive government and all that, you know, and you know, if you study governments today, if you study human history, you know, the folks who are saying this stuff are far from oppressed. Far from oppressed. They have all manner of options. They can go to their city council, they can testify, they can, you know, all manner of things, right? So that's not a factually based thing. I would imagine they have some, you know, just on the basis of their education, they have some sense that there is this thing called, that there's totalitarianism, right? Nazi Germany, that there are military authoritarian states, that there is the Soviet Union, right? Like they must know on some level this isn't that, right? But yet they feel this way, right? They feel powerless, and feeling powerless means oppression, and that means we live under tyranny. But yet they can still go out and make this like very nuanced legal argument and win the day, despite the fact they're oppressed, right? Like those two things to me, how do you have oppression and that you've just brilliantly lawyered this, you know, like anyway. So it's just that there's so much just tension and contradiction. Anyway, just really enjoying this. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair to just mention that my observation is a little chilling in the sense that I suspect there is some strategy of creating legitimization. I find the doing civic activities quite chilling, because I mean, this is a pattern of some terrorist organizations where they provide services and win the hearts and minds of the local population, and therefore gain more power and loyalty. We have a chat going on for those that are attending, and there's been a discussion of activities, their activities on different community events. And in Ohio, I was at a recent community event actually last fall, and I needed to buy a sweatshirt for my daughter because I forgot to bring her coat. And the only booth that had like a nice sweatshirt was one that was clearly from a militia, so I got it for her. And it was soft on the inside and nice, and it had its like little military branding. And I thought it was a little ironic too. She's African American, but anyway. And the gentleman was incredibly nice. If I didn't have the research background that I did, I would have probably struck up a longer conversation in a way that was friendlier. Having said that, it is time to invite the responders to turn on their cameras, and I'll ask the presenters to turn off their cameras unless you're asked questions. So thank you. Okay. Thank you so much for being here. I think I'll shift things around a little bit and not have Felicia on the hot spot, and ask Reverend Dr. Meyer if you would like to speak first.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you to all the presenters. This is a very important research that you're doing in the underside, and really appreciated the way Dakota broke down the nomenclature around militia and et cetera from the legal perspective. I think that's very helpful, and lays out an important policy strategy going forward. And I hope there are those who can begin to take that up, so we can codify some guardrails in society. What I really would like to do is rely upon my domain, what I know, talk about from what I know. And as a theologian, my concern is the meta narratives that actually deliver the values that we operate by without ever thinking about them. And as I listen to the data around these local militias, what I hear is the breakdown, the transition in the meta narrative that has really brought us up to the 21st century. And I've done some other work around this in terms of globally, what we're seeing is a global breakdown of what you might call the standard model of how society is supposed to work, Western democratic society, I should say, Euro descendancy sort of failing, and the place of men in that, and finding their meaning and their purpose by living out that role that this larger meta narrative sort of gives them. And as I listen to the data from the various researchers, what I'm really hearing, and what I didn't hear is discussion of, say, veteran suicides and etc., which I also want to link up with this movement as well, is a fragilization. We use a word from philosopher Charles Taylor, the fragilization of the sort of mental model that gives people meaning in the world, and particularly males. And we see this in the incel phenomenon as well. Who am I, and what's the meaning of my life, and etc. Some of the acts, what the shooter in Jacksonville really sort of fits into that incel model. And so here's sort of the question that I want to put to the sociologists and anthropologists and et cetera. To what degree are you just working within the sort of fallen narrative of what meaning is, and to what degree are you beginning to look and ask about this defragilization, this breakdown of larger models? And when I look at the US Census, for instance, recently, the largest growing household is multinational, multiracial, multicultural. Right? Our society is becoming multicolored at the family level. But as I listen to this data, there are these pockets that sort of want to hold on to white purity, to just use a shortcut, and they're having a hard time making the transition. And I'm just wondering how we begin to talk about the need for this larger narrative about what it means to be human, and how we go about doing that, and what role people who have lost their narrative for purpose, what role can they find in a new emerging narrative that I don't think has been well named yet. I don't know if we're maybe 2 generations away from naming it yet, etc. But it just seems to me that some of these people are being driven by forces larger than themselves. I was very interested by the de-individualization research. They're really being driven by larger forces that they don't really understand. And just to close out, I recall the Air Force general in Iraq saying that the Iraq War was really about making certain Christianity survived, and then he got pulled aside for making those remarks, right? And rightly so, I might add. And so I'm just wondering about this larger meta-narrative breakdown of who I am in the world, what gives me purpose and place, and how that shows up in your research.
Would any of the presenters like to respond? Caroline, and then Hope.
I think that's a really excellent point, Reverend Myers. I haven't researched that specifically, but I did know when I first started studying the militia movement in the 90s, late 90s in Kentucky, the state was going through these major upheavals. You know, the tobacco settlement was coming into place, which was going to ultimately destroy the most profitable form of farming in the state. The mining industry was crashing. It was a blue state that would very quickly become red. And when I was there, it hadn't yet made that transformation, and the militias were kind of part of that churn. And the thing that I noticed was at that moment was that there weren't a lot of voices from the top or the bottom up or at the state level from either political party that was addressing those actual changes. And so the militia was an outlet for, and it wasn't just young men, it was families, huge chunks of the community that, it's the absence of other discourses, it's the absence of other ways of just being able to describe what's happening. So I remember when this was going on in Kentucky, the governor at the time, Paul Patton, was a Democrat, and he was supporting a restriction and a reduction on Black lung. I forget, there was a program that where if you had Black lung, you could get assistance, and he was restricting it. And I was like, well, what's who's looking out for the working class person here, who's certainly paid their dues and should be getting something? And it wasn't coming from the Democratic Party. The Republican Party was not saying anything about it. It wasn't addressing it. And there weren't like these civil society groups that were providing other forms of, I think the meta narrative about who you are is important, but also these meta narratives about what are the avenues that you can make your life better. And so, the unfortunate credit goes to the militia movement, even though it was providing a conspiratorial framework for that. It was one of the frameworks that was out there, and it didn't have a whole lot of competition.
I think that's an important insight, that I tend to believe that unless we know, unless there's a larger story that we know we have a place in, we'll make up a story so that we have a place in it. And to me, the militia narrative seems to be doing that with a large section of people who really sort of feel lost in the transition of the world. And the story you tell about the Democratic governor in Black lung just brings that to mind, that, in political science that I've read, there's been a movement towards college education as a base for the Democratic Party, away from working labor. And that's just followed the way markets and accept. And so there is this class of people who really have been looking for, who's our family, if you will, the large sort of narrative family. And for lack of finding it, they're creating their own. We call that populist. I'm not certain if that's a fair way of describing it. But these are people who are in search of meaning. And if political violence, if organizing on a kind of clan level, that's how I look at these militias, they're more like clans, organizing on a clan level, and then political violence is the way we restore meaning in our life when no other portions of society are delivering it. What other option do we have? That's kind of what I'm hearing in the political discourse, and I'm just wondering if the research is hearing that or hearing something else.
So a large part of my research, I look at kind of this idea of relative deprivation and this idea of we are now victims. So a lot of the kind of racism that you kind of brought it up through this idea of white purity. A lot of this outgrouping comes from, it's easier to draw more people in with a victim narrative saying we are the oppressed, we are the ones being oppressed, when in the past it was not necessarily dog whistle racism, it was pure supremacy. So a lot of the rhetoric in the past was centered around white supremacy. but a lot of people do not adhere to those kinds of doctrine, or it really turns a lot of people off. But they can associate with feeling marginalized. They can associate with feeling victimized. And they can associate, especially within kind of our culture, of losing meaning and significance in their lives. And I think that's really important with my research, is that when people exit the military, they often feel like, and this isn't for everyone, this is usually surrounded by those involuntary role exits that I brought up. They feel isolated and alienated from a society, the military society, that they thought that they belonged. And so they are looking and seeking that significance elsewhere. And that marginalization, that victimhood mentality really resonates with people who blame others for kind of their position. So I think that we are hearing that, and we are kind of seeing these descriptions of, for lack of a better word, loss of status by others gaining status is kind of the issue of the day.
Thank you. Dakota, I see you turned on your camera. I'd like to speak, and we'd like to keep this moving so that Felicia and Brad have a chance to talk too.
Yeah, thank you. Very briefly. Reverend Dr. Meyer, thanks so much for the kind words and your insightful comments here. One other frame I wanted to add for this, picking up on the point about the direction of the Democratic Party with college education and the economic displacement and whatever, just all these trends, right? For folks who live in rural areas, and have kind of blue collar backgrounds. So another lens for this is the reaction against professionalism and professionalization. We've seen a lot of data about declining public support for institutions of all varieties, and that includes professions, right? And there's part of the populist phenomenon is a reaction against professionalism. And so what we see with the militias, right, is that they're embracing a non-professional view of carrying arms, right, and of protecting your community. Well, what's happened with the military, right? I mean, very professional. The militia now, since the Dick Act under the National Guard, very professionalized with all sorts of training standards and paperwork and certifications, and and even for law enforcement, right, now much more professionalized, right, than it was in the past. So they're going to that, and they're trying to say, look, this is how it's supposed to be. This is how it was during the founding era. And, of course, that's, everything good comes out of the founding era. Of course, what they're ignoring is all the founding era evidence that cuts against it, such as, George Washington, the kind of, uber Chad, if you will, of the founding era. George Washington was a massive skeptic of militias. He was a massive driver towards professionalization. So, it's just another example of this kind of selective reading of history, very romantic, very kind of non-urban, non-sophisticated, non-professional view of things, which seems to kind of just point arrows at them, buttress them, right? That sort of thing. So thank you.
Thank you. Felicia.
Morning, everyone. I'm again just so grateful for all of your work. Laura, I was 3 minutes behind schedule this morning, and I didn't know, are you wanting us to say kind of who we are because there are new people on?
That's a good idea. Why don't you go ahead and do that?
Okay. And I know that Reverend Myers didn't get to do that too, but so morning, everyone. I'm Felicia. I am a member of the House of Representatives in Michigan. This is my second term. Before this, I served for almost a decade on our county commission here in Michigan. I get to represent the part of Ann Arbor and other cities and townships, and we get to represent between about 90 and 100,000 folks here. But before I was a state rep, and I still do practice. I'm a clinical psychologist. I have my master's in clinical social work, my doctorate in clinical psychology, and so kind of come at everything that we're talking about through both of those lenses. And so here were my thoughts. Let me get to my notes. Well, first I'm going to build off of what Reverend Myers was talking about in terms of what I heard was sense of belonging. And I was thinking about that when Hope was talking. And Hope, if I heard you correctly, you were talking about the folks the veterans who you got to study as having a weaker identity. But what I immediately thought of, again, from my psychological perspective, was, but there's strong groupthink and a strong sense of belonging. And that, I think, is buttressed by what Dakota was just talking about, which is, are these shifts that we're seeing in terms of the growing sentiment of what feels like, you all know better, this is your research, of the us versus them, and really being steeped in that, and then trying to find a way to express that and garner some sense of power in kind of that lack of, or feeling powerless. And so I had that thought. I hope if you have a response, I'd love to hear it. I think groupthink is very powerful. And even in the face of weak identity, I think that it can kind of dismiss, that becomes secondary or even tertiary when there's strong groupthink.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I don't refer to it necessarily as a weak identity, is because there's such strength in having a strong social identity that sometimes it can overpower our own individual identity.
Yeah.
So one of the issues is that how do we then get individuals to have a stronger personal identity? How do they find significance in their own lives outside of the group identity? And a lot of that group identity can be geared towards blaming others for their position, whereas when we kind of gain self-efficacy, we kind of take control of our lives and find significance within our daily lives.
Yeah. And that ask can be really hard, right? That ask of, hey, let me look at, in terms of have and have not. And if folks feel like there's this kind of encroachment on what they have, are they willing to, what do they want to do with that? And if folks are feeling even more powerless, then I think the trend to kind of dig in. I mean, there was a seminal work in my field that many of you probably heard of. I can't remember when it came out, a long time ago, called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. Peggy McIntosh was the author of that. And it spoke about white privilege. And one of the main tenets of it is basically like, folks have to be willing to take a step back for us to really truly have equity, in whatever spaces. And I feel like that's in direct conflict to what we're talking, the dynamics of what we're talking about now, which is, I just think is really interesting. So that was one thing. The other, let me check my notes here. The other thing that I was thinking about, Dakota, it was fascinating to just hear you talk about militias, Michigan, and maybe it was Carolyn who talked about, it was, there was a major plot for our governor to be kidnapped, and since there have been trials. But what's fascinating, there are a couple of things that are fascinating about this. One, kind of the rise in militia groups here in Michigan, and what we're seeing. Our Attorney General has sent in kind of testimony to the Oversight Committee in Congress about this, particularly leading up to the last election, and kind of where Michigan sits in this. There are some of us who are legislators who have also worked with Georgetown's Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, and on a specific bill around militia groups. Now we have something right now. The Constitution prohibits private military units, but what we need is some clarifying language around definitions, and then also to enact both criminal and civil prohibition. So we still have some work to do working with Georgetown and their folks. We'll see the other role that I play for both of our, for the entire legislature is I'm the chair of our, there's a fancier title, but the Gun Violence Prevention Caucus. And so this bill is, in that, is through that caucus. And so it's something that we're continuing to work on. My guess is it will be an issue for, my hope at least is that it'll be an issue for lame duck this year. But these are just very real things that we deal with. I was talking yesterday, I alluded to this, kind of our safety, particularly leading up to the last election. It was not uncommon. Well, actually, even after, I would say over the past 4 years, it has not been uncommon, or there are days where I walk to the Capitol and I'm walking in between folks with very big guns. I don't know all the names of guns, so I apologize. But and it's intimidating, right? It's intimidating to walk to work. All I'm doing is trying to go to work, right? And that's the way that I'm walking to work is, through people who are yelling and screaming and angry and have these large weapons. And I think it's meant to, right? It's meant to intimidate. And so we are working on those things as well. But part of what we don't have here, and I think Carolyn and Priya spoke about this, was we have sheriffs who say the governor can, the legislature can enact things, the governor can sign it, but we're not going to enforce, whether it's COVID, common sense gun laws, things like that. We hear that a lot as well. So.
Thank you, Felicia.
Mhm.
To be clear, I thought yesterday when you said that you walked to work with men with large guns, that they were security. So
Oh,
it's
God.
not.
Yeah, no, sorry, I should have been clear about that. So we do have sergeants who are there to help protect us, but there are also times when there are big rallies, at the Capitol, and there are hundreds of people on the Capitol lawn, and this is I've never taken a picture of it, so to be able to show, because I think I'm just trying to get to work, but it's intense, to be sure.
So in the interest of time, I'd like to invite Brad to join us, and then we need to move on to the last session. Thanks.
Do you want to just move on to the next session, or?
Well, do you have any comments you'd like to say before we
I
move
just
on?
have a general comment. So my name is Brad Bushman. I'm a professor of communication here at Ohio State, and I study aggression and violence. For example, I was a member of President Obama's Gun Violence Committee, and I've testified before Congress about youth violence. But just a general comment to throw out, this session was excellent, and this has become my new favorite symposium, I guess. But a lot of the all the talks today reminded me of the excellent work done by Albert Bandura on moral disengagement. And he talks about various disinhibitory devices, and one of those is moral justification. And I see this woven through all the talks that we heard today, whether that be the Constitution or the Founding Fathers or whatever, that what people involved in militias are engaged in, they view as morally justifiable. So anyway, I'll leave it at that because I know we're short on time.
Go ahead, Felicia.
Can I just add one quick thing? I think
Sure.
this was Priya and Caroline were talking about this, about not finding, so I'm sorry if it wasn't you, but someone today said not finding a link between elected officials and far right. And I don't know what kind of degree of association you're talking, but I can tell you that I have a colleague of mine whose wife was the then co-president of the Republican Party in Michigan, who organized buses to be able to, for January 6th, to drive from Michigan to DC, and was posting all about it while there. And he's still serving today. And so I just wanted to put that out there as well.
Thank you. Carolyn?
Say really quickly that Priya's got this in the chat, but we were actually talking about a link between the Virginia Citizens Defense League and the militia. However, in our paper, we didn't bring this up, but the one of the congressmen in Virginia, Bob Good, when he won his second primary and he gave a speech, after he won, he was flanked on stage by the Campbell County Militia. So there were certainly politicians that are working with these groups. Can I just say one other thing? Because I think that you made a really good point, Felicia, about I think it was the Macintosh book about, and I wanted to say, I think it's important we recognize, and Hampton's got a great point here also in the chat, that in-group definition isn't just about deprivation. It can be about deprivation. It can also be about relative deprivation, but it can also literally be a deprivation, a sense of deprivation that is created out of whole cloth. And I think Dakota made that point. So I do think it's important to recognize that not everyone who's on the far right it's not just a working class phenomenon. It's the construction of an in-group that defines itself this way. But it can verge really close to white supremacy, or it can be more latent, or, so there's a big thing that what's important is that these in-groups get crafted. It becomes a discourse, I guess.
Thank you. That was a really important point to end this discussion on. So thank you for bringing that up and emphasizing it.